This is Mary Page from Chicago, and welcome to this week's Rights in Russia interview on the situation for human rights defenders in Russia. Today, our guest is Aleksandr Verkhovsky. He is the director of the Moscow-based Sova Information and Analysis Center and a member of the Presidential Council on Human Rights and Civil Society. Thank you for joining us, Aleksandr, and sharing your perspectives and research to help us better understand some of the background to human rights issues in Russia. So to frame our conversation, I had some questions that I'd like to pose, which I hope to complete in about 30 minutes. So let's get started with my first question. Could you tell us something about your organization, the Sova Centre, when and why it was founded, and what are its main goals?
Sova Centre is a kind of a small NGO-based think tank. It was established in the late 2002, and I mean several persons who really founded. We were working at that moment at Panorama Research Center for years already, and we started this new work in agreement with Moscow Helsinki group. The point was to be more associated with the human rights movement in Moscow and in regions. Our main focus from the beginning was a threat of nationalism, hate crimes, hate speech, especially in mass media, and also the things related to freedom of religion and belief. Since then, we were doing some monitoring. We publish news every day on these issues, reports, some advocacy work, of course. Later, of course, topics slightly changed because reality has changed during all these years. And one of most prominent parts of our activity now is working on the issues on what we call misuse of anti-extremism policy, because it became a big issue in general in Russia.
Great. So as a civil society organization, to what extent is the Sova Centre able to function normally in today's environment? And has it been impacted by the legislation on foreign agents or undesirable foreign organizations, for example?
I believe nobody can function normally in today's Russia. Our organization was enlisted as foreign agent organization already in the very end of 2016. We were not in the first, among those who were first called by this name, but we were sure that it's supposed to happen sooner or later, and that happened. As a research group, we are not so much affected by this status if to compare to groups who, for example, work with schools or universities, because the major problem here is the problem with partnership. People are afraid to deal with foreign agents. Some can deal with that, some just try to skip, not to reply, of course, not to organize some common events. We understand that, we understand people, especially those who depend on the government more than we do, they have to do something to make some compromises. So for us, it's not as hard as for many others. But yes, we have to keep this label everywhere and make some extra bureaucratic work, paid fine to the state for non-including ourselves to this list, and so on. As to the law on undesirable organizations, as you know, the list of undesirable organizations was opened with the major foundations working with Russian civil society. So of course we were affected. We lost several our donors because we just cannot have agreements with them anymore.
So does the designation, the foreign agent designation, does that affect your polling at all? Are people hesitant to answer questions?
As we do not make polling in the literal sense of the word, but when we make interview with somebody, mostly people do not try to escape, because interview it's not so dangerous. To make some common effort to organize and know round table in their region together, that's different thing.
You mentioned when you began the Sova Centre that nationalism was one of the key issues that you were interested in. And so we're thinking that when the Soviet Union collapsed, many people thought that for the first time there would be a Russian state. But since it's still very much a multi-ethnic state, nationalism in Russia seems complicated. So how does this play out?
You know, there were people, of course, who believed, and still there are such people, that the state has to be, let's say, ethnic state, in homogenic from cultural point of view. It's a rather old idea, very popular between two world wars, including in Eastern Europe. And it's very difficult to apply such an idea to Russia. For that, you have to make very weird map of purely Russian regions. There were people who believed that it would be better for ethnic Russians to live in this pure Russian country, but it's not so popular idea. So the most popular nationalist ideas are closer to one of two options. One option is a state where ethnic Russians have priority, formal privileges, minorities are more or less discriminated depending on minority. So it's supposed to be some special regulation here. And another option is more traditionally imperial, I would say, that we had Russian Empire, then we had Soviet Union, which was obviously an empire too. And in fact, we have to say that our current state, Russian Federation, still operates partly, at least partly, as an empire. If we look how the Northern Caucasus is governed, it resembles much imperial type of ruling and governing. Some people might think it's better for the region or for the country than separation, for example. It's a discussable thing. The problem is that any kind of nationalist approach, which itself is a legitimate part of European political spectrum, always provoke conflicts and tensions. So on the one hand, as people who think about human rights and non-discrimination, we are against any nationalist approach because it provokes discrimination. On the other hand, our government is against any ethnic nationalist approach because it provokes conflicts inside the country and strategically in opposition to the government. So we had our nationalist movement, which we had in 90s and in 2000s, was mostly oppositional. And finally, it lost its political battle with the government, to make it short. And now we practically have no nationalist movement. just few small and weak groups for the moment. It doesn't mean that nationalism will disappear. It cannot disappear. We have now a kind of a pause, I think, in the development of Russian nationalism and nationalisms of many ethnic minorities, because we have regions like Bashkortostan, for example, which have rather strong traditions of Bashkort nationalism.
You also mentioned the work that you've done on extremism in Russia, and so looking at that sector, some research suggests that the threat of extremism from non-state actors in Russian society has decreased since the 1990s. At the same time, there seems to be more and more anti-extremist legislation right now. Is this correct? And if so, what's the explanation?
You know, when we discuss an extremism, we have to keep in mind some definition of what extremism is. Usually, people say that extremism is taking some extreme approaches to political struggle or any other struggle. And what these extreme approaches are, why are they extreme, and what has to be prohibited here or just seen as a possible radical option. That's always a problematic thing in any country. In our country, in 90s, it was rather open space. If you do not start real rebellion, it's still possible and tolerated from legal point of view. Even if the law prescribed to prosecute, I mean in 90s, for certain public statements like incitement to revolution or to kind of pogrom or whatever, in practice, it was not prosecuted. But then the political regime has changed. We got what in early Putin years was called a rule of law. It's not a rule of law which we know in English language. It's in Russian, it sounds like a dictatorship of law, meaning that we, the state, have to invent the law which gives us possibility to make anything we want and stay in the field which we can call a legal field. And they created the law on countering extremist activity, which included a definition of extremist activity so wide it can cover practically anything. Of course, I try to explain it maybe in simplifying, just to be brief. From the very beginning, it did not change the scene so much, but then law enforcement developed, and later it really made very serious effect in the spheres of political activism or religious activism or any kind of activism. On the other hand, there are threats not for the state, but for citizens. And the major part of such threats was related to street violence, hate crimes, which were not so prominent in the 90s, but became really very frequent since the beginning of new century. We have no real statistics. Our organization tries to keep some record of such crimes, but we understand that we see just a small part of them. And government initially could ignore these crimes because they did not see political threat here. But in the middle of first decade of our century, they found that there is some connection between this street violence and radical political opposition. And when they found it, they concentrated serious resources of law enforcement system against those which are usually people and groups who are usually called radical nationalists. They really arrested, thousands of those radical nationalists who were involved in violent activity. It was, let's say, a positive part from the point of view of the society as a whole. But at the same time, the law enforcement against which is prescribed by this law against public statements and against membership in certain organizations which could be prohibited as dangerous ones, more and more shifted to, let's say, less dangerous activity. For example, if in the beginning to be prosecuted for incitement to hatred, you had to propagate some kind of hatred and violence for years, then it was enough to make some one intolerant comment in social network. Okay, let's really intolerant, but one. And finally, even the government noticed that there are too many criminal prosecutions for minor things. And of course, if they have such flexible instrument, it was too big, too strong temptation to use it for prosecuting oppositional groups or some dissident religious groups. And that was used rather widely. So if we compare situation in the beginning of 2000s, around 2010, for example, and today, we see that anti-extremism law enforcement, starting from a rather positive approach for protecting people, their security, their equality from extreme groups, turned to rather random enforcement against those who are seen as a danger by the state for sometimes completely unclear reasons. Like maybe the most obvious example is the total ban for organizations of Jehovah's Witnesses as extremists. Why are they extremists? Because from legal point of view, they are seen as extremists because they propagate the superiority of their faith. And the definition in the law gives possibility to interpret the law this way. That's bad itself, of course. On the other hand, of course, there is some real reason behind that. And this reason is that the government sees Jehovah's Witnesses as a big potential threat for the state's security. Why are they thinking so? We may just speculate, but the fact is that their suspicions are enough for total ban of the whole religious movement, and which gives possibility to prosecute for any member of this movement for participation in the banned religious organization. Of course, it's just a big example and maybe most straightforward example, but there are many others. It became a problem, and what is interesting that last years it became even possible to discuss it with authorities because even some high-level officials see that there are some unpredicted consequences of this law enforcement. So some legal norms were reformed to more positive option, but generally these reforms are very, very limited. So the law itself and the law enforcement are very problematic. We see it, and we try to continue advocacy, but in our position as foreign agents, it's difficult to make a domestic advocacy work. We try, but we have rather limited capacity.
You mentioned Jehovah's Witnesses, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about freedom of conscience in Russia more generally, how you assess that these days.
Our government believes that there are some religious groups may produce a political threat, and that's true. We have a big example, let's say in our country, that certain groups or trends inside Islam supported terrorist activity on the Northern Caucasus and around, and not only in our country, of course. And this experience was analyzed and interpreted broader for the religious activity in general. The whole concept is, as it was explained previously when there were more public discussion on issues. Now everything is much less open, let's say, that any religious innovation is potentially dangerous. So keeping a traditionality in religious sphere is the purpose of the government. So if you are Muslim, it's okay. If you are traditional Muslim, and the same is about Christians, about anything. The problem is who decides who is traditional and who is not, and what does it mean in general, traditionality. There are certain experts who work with the government for that. Sometimes their beliefs, I mean experts' beliefs, are really weird. Sometimes they just make mistakes, real factual mistakes when they cannot differentiate between certain religious groups. That also happened. So we have a rather long list of religious groups or trends which are banned as terrorist or extremist ones. Sometimes these groups even didn't exist, in fact. But it doesn't prevent from real law enforcement. Because again, the law enforcement depends on on the same experts and their view of what is happening. And that all happening inside a federal security service system. So it's not debatable in the society. There is no discussion what kind of Salafi teaching, for example, is possible and what is impossible in our society. So in practice, any Salafi is at least under strong suspicion from authorities, and it depends on region, of course, and so on, and many personal factors, I believe. So generally speaking, if you follow in Russia not only traditional religion, but traditional religious organization, which has some informal approval from authorities, everything's more or less fine. If not, you may be in trouble anytime, and it depends on the approach of certain bureaucrat on the local level. It may happen with Protestants, Hare Krishnas, whoever.
Very uncomfortable, I imagine,
yes,
right? Western media tend to paint a very bleak picture of Russia these days. Is that a true picture? What's your assessment?
If we compare today's Russia with Russia 10 years ago, not talking about 20, of course, it's true. But life is very different for different groups. Those religious groups which we discussed now is a good example. Many believers do not feel any pressure. So for them, freedom of conscience is something obvious. They are not touched. And the same is about any other political groups or groups of activists. But the problem is that this extreme approach to fighting potential threats to security is extending. So now more or less any independent group, I mean independent from the government, cannot feel secure because it's an easy target for any bureaucrat which may have any reasons to attack this group, but can easily use a language of security that to present this group as a threat to security. And it's very difficult to discuss it because at least part of such discussion always is conducting behind closed doors somewhere. And my impression is that this part of discussion, which we do not see, is most important one. That's the problem. And this fear of decisions which are made behind closed doors and mostly behind doors of FSB, this fear is extending, and it's produced a lot of problems, even for those who do not feel themselves oppositional. And of course, it makes people oppositional, even if they were not.
Is that on the local level as well as the federal level?
Sure. It's on every level, and it depends on the region, on regional authorities, on local authorities. It may differ on various issues. In some places, for example, if there is certain person in authorities who, I don't know, really hates the same Jehovah's Witnesses, it will make troubles for them because he has all possibilities to express his hatred, not openly, but through law enforcement system. But in the same kind of person in other region may have no such possibility because, for example, a head of local FSB office is not much interested. We see that people are persecuted very much differently depending on region for more or less the same behavior. There is no any consistency in this law enforcement.
So given this environment, what do you think the future holds for the protection of human rights in Russia?
It's difficult, in fact, to talk about future in Russia. I think that in nearest future, at least in nearest years, we will have the same political regime. And this political regime is not much interested in human rights, of course, but it may agree sometimes that there are issues and they have to be resolved. Yes, if it does not touch the key point, their security. If they feel that certain human rights initiative does not touch their security, it can be discussed. The problem is, again, that we never know what they see as a threat. So, for example, this Presidential Human Rights Council, which becomes weaker and weaker from year to year, still can discuss certain issues with various governmental agencies, and once a year with Putin himself. And sometimes it makes some positive effect. Of course, much more rare than we would like to, but sometimes it is possible. And it's completely unpredictable when. I don't know, I deal with human rights and some domestic advocacy work for years now, and I still don't understand what to expect in any certain situation. Generally, the situation is turning to worse, and it's always an impression that our work as human rights defenders and any civil activists is to minimize the damage more than to make something really better. In certain areas, it is possible to make a progress, of course, but in areas related to political and civil rights, it's more about minimizing damage of new restrictive initiatives which we have, especially in certain periods, of course, like now when we have parliamentary election, which makes authorities nervous, and when they are nervous, they produce a lot of repressive initiatives. What will happen later in 10 years, I don't know. I am not ready even to imagine. I cannot imagine.
On that note, I am afraid that we have run out of space for more questions, but I want to thank you, Aleksandr Verkhovsky, for making yourself available to Rights in Russia and for sharing your insights. Goodbye.
You're welcome.
And wishing you the very best. And thanks
you
again for that very enlightening conversation.
Thank you, Mary.